Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. Another exciting conversation awaits you here today because Meghan and I have something central in common: our passion for grief and trauma. Speaking the same kind of language, our conversation flowed easily through her personal story of dealing with many losses and trauma, leading to her professional work with clients dealing with grief and trauma, especially in the workplace.
So one of the questions, I'm sure you get this all the time too, but one of the questions is like, when do I have to go see a therapist? And like, when is it bad enough that I need to go see treatment? And in that question is still the bias that you shouldn't, right?
Exactly.
If your eyes were bothering you, or if you felt like maybe you had a rash that was allergies, we wouldn't be like, well, don't go until you have, we'd be like, I don't know, go see a doctor, ask them. Maybe there's a lotion, maybe there's some explanation.
About this week's guest. Meghan Riordan Jarvis is an author, podcast host, TEDx speaker, and a psychotherapist specialising in trauma, grief, and loss. After experiencing PTSD following the death of both of her parents within 2 years of each other, Meghan began speaking on a larger scale about the importance of understanding grief and supporting grievers. Founder of Tacking Point Partners, Meghan and her team consult regularly with companies addressing grief in the workplace. Meghan's Grief is My Side Hustle platform includes her popular podcast of the same name, her blog, and her free grief writing workshop, Griefmates. Meghan's memoir, The End of the Hour, will be published in December 2023. So welcome, Meghan. Thank you so much for taking time to be my guest on the podcast.
Oh, Natalie, it's such a joy to be here. Thank you for having me.
How are you today?
I woke up this morning with the phrase emotional hangover in my head. I slept on the couch last night because my house felt very hot, which I can never tell if maybe that's actually just my body is really hot. I'm a woman of a certain age, so I get hot at night. But the cover to my first book was announced yesterday. I know this cover. I've had this cover in the back of my mind for several months. I assumed it was not going to feel like much, and that is not what happened. It was really overwhelming to have so many people respond to this piece of art, which is connected to, a book that's coming out, which is a memoir. So, yesterday my system was really stormy. It was hard for me to eat. It was hard for me to sleep. So I'm just carrying that into today. And just, the storm is quieting. I'm looking forward to the weekend.
I'm really excited to dive into your story of loss and trauma, and for the listener to hear, what is this memoir about? I mean, what is your memory of your life in relation to loss and trauma about? Why don't we start there?
Yeah, sure. So as you know, I work as a trauma therapist in Washington, D.C. I'm sort of pivoting away from working with clients and doing more sort of talking on a larger level to people. But sorry, I think I would say I've been backing myself accidentally into that space since I was about 9 years old. When I was 9, a teenager that was beloved to everyone, but particularly my family. So his family and mine, we called each other cousins. And he drowned on a beach that we were all on and didn't realize. He was 16. And it was the, early 80s. It was 1983. And sort of the ethos back then was like, protect the kids from the bad things. And I, at the time, just thought something very bad and sad happened. And then that ended. And then life went on. And it happened in an area where we spent our summers. And so we then transitioned back to where we were for the school year. So when I went back as a 4th grader into my life, literally no one knew what had happened at the end of July. And no one spoke about it. My mother did not go to the school and say, I just need you to know, I'm one of 6, that like, this is something that happened. My oldest brother actually found Chris, his name was Chris, in the water. And my mom experienced PTSD from being there and seeing this teenager's body be pulled from the water. But I didn't know any of that. So what unfolded for me was in my 20s, when I moved down to DC, I went through a breakup. And I knew that the way that the breakup was hitting me was not the way breakups hit everyone else I saw. I hadn't had a lot of romantic relationships. And this one felt like I was going to die. Mm. And this beloved woman, a woman who worked at this social policy think tank that I was at, just sort of slipped me the name of a therapist. And she was like, look, she's a network. I go to her. She's great. Why don't you go? And I just knew that I had kind of exhausted the good-heartedness of the friends that I had made. I was sort of new to these friendships. And I went to therapy, and God loved this woman who was a very imperfect person. I feel like it's important to say that. She was a tremendous therapist who also had her own problems. And I loved her for that. She said in the first session, I just cried and was like, I can't live without this love that used to be in my life. And she was like, yep, that's the way that feels. And also we'll probably spend some time talking about like your family. And my response to that was like, no, they're perfect and not the problem. There was so much love in my big family. And in the second session, she said something like, well, how did you handle hard feelings? And I was like, I don't understand what you're asking me, right? Mm-hmm. And so over the course of the next 10 years, I came to understand that so many of the things that I felt and did were really tagged back to this unresolved trauma from childhood. Wow. The way that I felt isolated and alone and different, the way that I would have outsized reactions, this irrational fear that lots of grievers carry. I mean, I'm 49. I still now sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with a terror that my oldest brother is going to die, which of course he will one day. But it's a lot to know at 9 that kids die and parents can't keep you safe. Mm. And there just were no adults to talk to. And I was really fascinated by this idea that like, you kind of have to either go inward or outward with trauma. That once the energy lands on you, for children, it often goes right inside. And instead of it being something that they feel that, I just feel afraid, you become afraid. I am afraid. And I absolutely became my feelings. They became limiting beliefs. They became who I was. And, the process of therapy just stripped it all back. I had so many more possibilities. And I was just really gently guided. I was in a group. I just did a ton of work. And then I became a therapist. And then my experience in therapy, being a therapist, was that I had different clients than I was. And some of my clients were coming in with different kinds of trauma. And what I would say, and I always say, is that every conversation I'm having in my office is about grief. That grief is the energetic response to loss, and that everyone is navigating some kind of loss. It might not be a death loss, but they are navigating that. And depending on what their childhood looked like and what their resources are, they can either manage that or not. I trained as a trauma therapist after I re-traumatized a client. I had a client come in, start to remember something that had been really traumatizing to her. And I said, what you're not supposed to say, well, why don't you just go ahead and tell me about what happened? And it reactivated all her somatics or her body-centered responses. And I knew that I had done the wrong thing, but I had no idea what the right thing was. And so I went to supervision and I started to talk to people, and they were like, oh, well, there's this whole other way of doing therapy that is body-centered. And then it was like somebody had taken me into the Wizard of Oz, into Oz, and I was meeting the wizard. And I was lucky enough to be in DC. So Bessel van der Kolk was down here doing trainings. There was IFS training happening. There was sensory motor psychotherapy, EMDR centers. I mean, just all of them. And I was like, whatever money I'm making as a therapist, I'm going to spend. And because you're trained in some of these things, these are not like you go to a lecture and they give a PowerPoint presentation. It is you find a partner and you are going to do this therapy with them. And I did PACT therapy with Stan Tacton, which is also, it's about sort of how your body is responding to your partner's body. And it's the most powerful kind of therapy. And so I had that under my belt. And I worked for a lot of years. I had 3 kids. I have a booming private practice because DC has lots of people who need therapy. I worked a lot with people in security. So people who had traveled across other countries and had bad things happen and not be able to talk to anyone. So I held some special sort of clearances to be able to talk to people. And I loved it. I mean, I just love being a therapist is just the honor of my complete life. And so I had 3 kids, my husband, job, all those things, and just happy all the time. Just couldn't believe what my life looked like. I felt like, boy, I had really figured it out. In 2016, my dad was diagnosed with small cell cancer, which is a terminal cancer. And I understood that he was going to die probably within a year of his diagnosis. And he actually died a year and 7 days after he was diagnosed. So I really participated in my dad's death. It was tricky because not everyone in my family, I have such a big family, was sort of all on the same exact square at the same time of understanding how ill he was or what he needed. He had different relationships. He was not an easy guy. My dad, I loved him a lot, but he was not easy. So we just had this, I would say, kind of wonderful 6 to 8 months where I flew up to where he was in Massachusetts from DC on the weekends and would just keep him company. And so some of what I did, because I had been a hospital-based therapist, social worker, some of what I did was advocate for his healthcare in my big, bad, like, I know what's supposed to be going on here format, which I'm sort of the closest my family has to anyone in the medical field. So I was practically helpful. And then, we did things like went through his phone and all his contacts and who did he want called and who was it okay if we emailed after he died. So when my dad died, it was unbelievably sad, but it was not traumatic for me. I mean, there were elements of it. I had some nightmares afterwards, but I just felt like I can do this. It's really sad. It's really hard. Didn't dysregulate me, didn't disrupt my family. And then in 2019, my mom died suddenly when I was on vacation with her at her house after a short illness that I was really aware of. I was really aware that she wasn't well. And I had taken her to the emergency room the week before she died. And when she died, a couple of things happened. One, which I think you'll appreciate, because I am unbelievably somatic. Like when I'm talking to clients, I feel energy through my body. It's hot or cold, it's thick, it's heavy. And so I know things that are not verbal. I was about an hour away from my mother's house. It was early in the morning with all my kids in the car, and I was picking up my nephew, another extended family, actually, the teenager who died, his cousin is my best friend. And so I was picking up my best friend's son. It's all interconnected. And I had, so my kids were upstairs in that house and I had this sensation of water breaking. Like it felt like when my water broke when I was pregnant with my daughter. And this clear thought that sort of came from the back of my head was she died. And so I knew my mother had died. And I called my husband back at her house where he was up and working. And I said, have you seen my mom today? And he said, no. And I said, I think she died. I need you to go into her room. And she had died. And my son, who had been he was with me that day, but the week before they had all been in England because my husband's English and he hadn't been sleeping for about a week. And when I talked to him, he was like, I just have this terrible feeling that someone I love is going to die. And the day that my mom died, he went to bed and, he's little and he was like, I don't feel bad anymore. I can go to sleep. And I was like, yeah, it's because you were holding the energy of this, impending death. I felt the energy of the death. So pretty much immediately, my husband, even though I called him to tell him my mother died, he called me back to tell me that she died. And I was already driving towards them because I was in just a total flight state. But I'm pretty pretty good in fight or flight. I narrow and I'm not dangerous and I don't do crazy stuff. I'm who you want in a emergency situation. So I pulled over to the side of the road because he insisted, and I was in this like broken down parking lot, and he told me she died. And for whatever reason, I needed to call all 5 of my siblings in that exact moment. So with a minivan idling full of children and, a phone that was dying, I called my siblings. And I have a lot of energy about that, because had I not been in such a hijacked state, I think it would have occurred to me that I could have called my siblings partners and given them had someone who loved them, who was in front of them, who could have helped co-regulate them. But honestly, that didn't even occur to me for a year. It didn't occur to me and then I just brutalized myself in my mind for like, why couldn't I have done a better job? I'm a trauma therapist. So pretty much from that moment, I had relentless ruminations about, what I didn't do, and that her death was my fault. In fact, I said it to every single one of my siblings, like, I think this is my fault. And then there was a lot of activity, there's funerals and people to call and things that have to happen. And I participated in all that activity. And then by the time we were driving back to DC, which I wasn't ready to do, I wasn't ready to leave. But life happens and you have to do things. My husband didn't have any more vacation, and we needed to come home so the kids could go back to school. So again, it was this terrible tragedy had happened at the end of the summer. And we were, people were like, wow, you have such a great tan. Did you have a wonderful summer? And I just couldn't even speak. So I pretty much sat on my porch swing and ruminated. And as a trauma therapist, I knew exactly what was happening. I had this metacognition of like, oh shit, this is PTSD. And I did the things. I was swimming. I was trying to walk every day. I was really, really struggling to eat. So I was trying to, at least give myself, carbohydrates and macronutrients. I was not sleeping at all. And ultimately, the body is so amazing. I was just keeping a very quiet footprint. People were trying to see me, but I couldn't be seen. I just felt like I was in pieces. And so I couldn't be seen. And so when people would say, oh, I'll come see you tomorrow, I had this like shtick where I was like, yeah, let's check in before you come. I knew they were not coming, but I just didn't want to say no to everything. So I'd be like, yeah, sure. Maybe I'll meet you there. And, then at the last minute, I'd be like, I'm sorry, I can't make it. I'm not feeling great. So ultimately I started swimming, and sort of the second crazy thing that happened was I was swimming in an outdoor pool, and I got out of the pool one day and I couldn't shake the water out of my ear. Couldn't shake it. A couple of days, couldn't shake it. And I was like, so I walked into a walk-in clinic, and the guy was like, whoa, I think I'm going to send you to an ENT. Something's not right. Well, I go to the ENT, and the guy's like, I don't know how to tell you this, but you have a condition that is mostly seen in like teenage surfers in Australia, where the water is really cold. It's called exotosis. You can also get it in your feet. I know it's so crazy, Natalie. Extra bones that grew like stalactites and stalagmites, so up and down from the canal of my ear. The bones had grown and basically fused together in both of my ears. And it's a condition that normally takes about 10 to 18 years to happen, but mine just happened. So, maybe there was something in there, but like I had actually had a hearing test not that long ago. So like these bones had, quickly erupted, and they were occluding. They were going to close, and in fact had closed so much that the water was having trouble coming out. So the treatment for that, of course, is surgery. They cut your ears off, they drill into your ear canal, and they drill out the bone.
Oh, wow. So
when I'm going through this whole rigmarole, this ENT is like, yeah, and it could impact your hearing. Like, what, is what's your job? Do you listen? And I was like, funny you should say. So I that was like a bridge too far. That was the idea that I was going to have what I thought at that moment was emergency surgery. It did not turn out to be emergency surgery. I was able to have it later. I just was like, I can't do this. So I came home. My husband was actually out of the country. He was coming back the next day. And then I threw my back out. And I threw my back out, which I've done multiple times. I did it when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. That was the most recent, though. That was the one that had been the most. Oh no, that was after. It was when my dad died. I threw my back out. And when I throw my back out, I'm completely immobile. So I was in the basement. My back was out. My husband had just gotten back. And I was sort of like not speaking to anyone because I couldn't handle what people were saying, not able to move, not really able to eat, not able to sleep. And I called a colleague and I was like, I need more help. And she said, you know what that means? And I was like, I know what that means. And she was like, just stay there. She gave me the name of a TV show she had just watched. And she called the same treatment facility in Tennessee that she and I both send all of our patients to when they're in crisis. And of course, they called me right back and said, can you come on Monday? And it was horrifying to find myself in the situation and unbelievably relieving. All I felt, like I could get emotional about it now. All I felt was relief that I understood what my symptoms were and how serious they were and how abnormal they were and that they were getting worse. And I had such a deep understanding of how scary that was for my clients and how they didn't know that. And that when they came to me, that was part of what I had to give them, because we don't talk about it enough as a culture. We just don't educate the world enough so that people can say, this is not right. Because my grief and my loss was traumatic. There are plenty of people who do what I did with my dad, which is, it's hard and sad and difficult, and the resources that are around you are enough. But there is a large percentage of people who have maybe not as strong a reaction as I did. But my central nervous system simply would not stop ringing like a bell. So I fell asleep after I talked to the colleague and the people at the treatment facility, which, I think I slept for 10 hours. It was basically the first time I slept since my mom died. And then I woke up and stood up. I hadn't been able to move for, stood up, walked upstairs and was like, I need to pack. And then it was 3 or 4 days later. So I spent 3 weeks in treatment, which is a very short stint. They do a lot of psychoed there that I don't need because I have a couple of master's degrees in the stuff that they were teaching. And I'm trained in all the things that they were teaching. But that's the beauty of it, which is, just knowing all the things doesn't mean that you get to skip.
Exactly. Because this is for the people that have me as a guest on a podcast ask, so did your training help you get through the grief? And I'm like, well, so I'm going to hear your answer. All this, and then you have your experience.
It helped me know. It helped me know.
No,
right?
but
so one of the questions, I'm sure you get this all the time too, but one of the questions is like, when do I have to go see a therapist? And like, when is it bad enough that I need to go see treatment? And in that question is still the bias that you shouldn't, right?
Exactly.
I don't know, if your eyes were bothering you, or if you felt like maybe you had a rash that was allergies, we wouldn't be like, well, don't go until you we'd be like, I don't know, go see a doctor, ask them. Maybe there's a lotion, maybe there's some explanation. And somehow when it comes to grief and loss, but not just grief and loss, I think anything that we struggle with mentally, we see it as some sort of failure or something out of order, instead of like, no, actually everybody's life hands them really dark tunnels. And there are people who have perspective. What I think is so important about, this is one of my soapboxes, is people's perception of therapy is like from watching The Sopranos, right? Like, it's like, well, you're probably going to sleep with your therapist and all they're going to do is ask you, how do you feel? And what is really important, I think, for everyone to know, but particularly grievers to know, because most of the people that came to my office had been in their symptoms for well more than a year. Many of them, 10 years. I'm thinking about Anderson Cooper and his podcast and how really what he's talking about, what he's explaining to people is traumatic grief. It's not, he had prolonged grief disorder in this sort of very traditional sense. but we don't distinguish it very well for folks. And so, what I think is really important is for people to understand, like, there's treatments. When I went to a facility to do it, but it could have happened, if I could have slapped together a whole bunch of people to see me every day, then I could have stayed in my house maybe. But EMDR is a treatment. And so it's a treatment like going to physical therapy is a treatment. And there is symptom reduction in EMDR for some people that is immediate and permanent. I mean, I've used EMDR and had people be like, wow, it's never felt the same that it did when I walked in here off of just doing one long EMDR session. And sensory motor, psychotherapy and somatic experiencing, again, the toolbox that we're giving you is not how do you feel about it, or what do you think about that, or could you, switch your thinking, which is all really good and important treatment. But most of what happens to us in grief is we have these little electrical currents that we call emotions that are unconscious. And yeah, we can think about them and name them with words and all of that, but that doesn't stop the currents moving. And so the regulation part is, the treatments. And so when I came out of treatment, I was not interested in talking about what happened. I wrote I have this journal next to me. Like, I wrote journals and journals and journals, and I started writing. And the gift that has come out of that is that that writing has been received by other people as, it's probably an interesting story to have a trauma therapist go to the same facility that she went, what can you tell us about that, Meghan? So I write both as, a person who treats PTSD and a person who had PTSD and has PTSD. I mean, it is a regular thing for me to say to my husband, like, I'm just having really relentless, memories, images, and thoughts around my mother's death. And I need to spend some time asking them to step back so that I can live my life. Yeah. But it's been a really humbling road, and one that has been life-changing for me. I came out of treatment with a different kind of passion about how to help people. And I hate that that's the way that these things often happen, which is like, you can't really know how to be the person who helps, or you can't really know exactly what it is until you go through it yourself. But I did find when I stepped back into my therapy chair, which was not for very long because COVID, I took 6 months off, which is an astounding amount of time to take off, but I worked for myself, and I promise you I couldn't have gone back to work sooner. And then I worked for about 3 months, and then COVID shut us down. And then I, started writing full time and started writing curriculums and op-eds. And I do a lot now where really what I'm talking about grief and loss. We don't always call it those words, to people in workplaces who are really struggling to understand coming back into the workspace, like why it's so hard. And it's so fascinating because I talk to grievers and they're like, oh, well, because they're trying to get you to go back to the way that it was before. Exactly. And there is that doesn't even exist anymore. It was like bombed out. And when I talk to companies and explain that, one of the things that is the most emotionally disturbing for people is when the world knows that something happened. Both your arms are broken, but nobody asks you about it. Like, that is crazy me. And that's a little bit what's happening in the workplace, is like, everybody knows that people's lives were upended, disrupted by death, but also non-death loss. Just their mother-in-law moved in with them, or their kid had a really hard time and now has OCD, just tremendous amount of changes in a very short period of time. Most of them making people feel sort of helpless and out of control at times, because that's what a pandemic is. And these folks in these work environments, they are really actually hungry to hear, this is how we talk about emotions.
So why do you think in the first place they don't talk about it? Why do you think workplaces, or in general people, sort of shy away from talking to the people about what's obvious, or what might be knowingly obvious, maybe not as like a broken arm that you can see? I mean, grief is not as visual as a physical illness, but why do you think people don't talk about it?
I think there's probably a different answer to why we don't talk about it in work. It's probably bleeds into the answer of why we don't do it all that well in a Western culture. And we really are geared that old, like for us, for in my country, the Americans of like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and like just hustle and you will achieve and everything is possible if you just work really hard. It's just a really deeply pervasive belief. I mean, I think it may also come from like, the Christian culture, the prosperity Bible of, if you do good things, God will give you good things, which is just not the truth. The people suffer, very good people suffer terrible tragedies. So I think we don't talk about it because it scares the crap out of us to talk about grief and loss. I think as humans, one beautiful defense we like to use is compartmentalization. And I think we don't talk about it because we have not educated people to talk about it. And I talk about this a lot on my platform, but my kids, all three of them now, have had these health classes in the US that teach them about their changing bodies through puberty. Exactly. And they're really awkward and they're miserable. And my kids never want to take those classes, but they're really important because if you don't know what is typically meant to happen and what is normal in terms of how you feel and what's going on with your body, that is such a fodder place for shame, because again, kids will take what they feel and what they think. And if they can't hold it with someone on the outside, they will take it inside and it will become something that is shameful because it's who they are instead of what's happening to them. And I think grief and loss, we have left it to people to sort of, go to your therapist for 1 hour at lunch and have your feelings and then come back and do your work.
And pack it away.
I mean, and the more people who know my work know that I'm really interested in neuroscience and the mind-body connection. And, I had a CEO say to me, like, I don't really believe in the mind-body connection. And I was like, well, I don't care if you believe in it. There's 12 cranial nerves and the vagus nerve actually, brings information from your body. I don't care if you believe in it. That doesn't stop the science behind it. Most people find learning about the science of what the body does in order to manage traumatic events.
I mean, even just the percentage that 80% of information comes from the body to the head. And
totally amazing.
So if you just say that to someone like that, I say, well, okay, 20-80.
Well, and then you ask them, like, haven't you ever been like had a nervous stomach? Not everybody throws their back out or has bones grow across their ears as an emotional response to something. I understand that, but everybody's been nervous. Everybody's had sweaty palms. Everybody's gotten a tension headache. So I think the answer to the question really is, it scares us because we're not well educated, and it scares us because we don't want to believe that that's the way that life really is. Mm. And those two things perpetuate how we behave. And then we just have this really unbelievably awkward culture about it. And, some of the lectures I give in companies are, I understand it's awkward. It's also awkward for me as someone who spends only my time doing this all day long. But, first sex is awkward, right? Like, we don't say to anybody, well, like, no, I know it's really awkward and fumbly and you feel really self-conscious, so don't do it. Just leave them alone. Don't call them again. We don't say that because, like, sex is great. Ultimately, the intimacy around connecting with people in real deep pain can be transformative in terms of people feeling, a sense of connection in humanity, spirituality, feeling safe. I mean, it can be transformative. So that's what I say to companies is, if you can shift your ability to do it in your culture right here. In the 1980s, we had Ronald Reagan talking about trickle down economics. Like, if we just let all the rich people do good things with their money, it's going to trickle down to the poor people. I always use that joke in companies because the guys are usually older than me. It's mostly guys. And I say, we're doing trickle down emotional education, that if you at the leadership level can say, actually, we're safe to talk about grief in here. We've thought about our policies around loss. We can talk about non-death loss. We understand that people are emotional creatures. We trust our managers to make, in the moment decisions about what people need. And look, we have a library here on site about grief and loss. One of our you and I work with Emma Payne and Help Texts. We contracted with a company like Help Text to send out texts that help educate and support people. I mean, I actually don't think it's that hard, but getting people to admit that we are emotional creatures everywhere we go is tricky at first. And to say, because what companies say is like, okay, Meghan, we'll talk about feelings, but how do we stop ourselves from becoming like a mental health clinic? We kind of have this black and white idea of like, we're going to not talk about it at all. We're just going to come here and make our widgets. And if we start talking about it, we all need to put on long flowy sweaters and, get yoga mats and tissue boxes, because we're just going to, and that's not how life works. It's not how grief works. I mean, one of the popular grief theories is, that we spend some time grieving and then we spend some time living.
I think it's the human condition. Like, we are born human. So being born human doesn't mean you just have a body, but you also have emotions and you have feelings, just like life starts with birth and it ends with death. That's the normal human condition. Interestingly, I found that when I did research for my most recent course on transforming grief, I was under the impression that, people just don't talk about it because we are a death-denying society. I sort of packed it under that. But I thought, okay, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. And what I found is an interesting research that they've done in the university in Israel, where a professor gave people images of themselves mixed with other images that were death related. So, for example, a funeral or a casket, different things. And what they found is that the brain negates any images of a person themselves in relation to something that has to do with death. Totally. So the brain just says, no, not to me. And what the article described was the feeling that if people hear something that is related to death or someone grieving, they say it happens to other people, but not to me. And I found that really fascinating, because it sort of made sense to me as to people like us who, have usually a personal experience. When you start working in grief and loss and trauma, you don't just get there because it's fun. You get there because of something 100%. That's happened in you, that you feel called to do that, right? So we are disillusioned. We have, both you and I, we had these traumatic losses. I held my daughter as she died on her third day. And as much as this was an honor, it also leaves an impact. It's not just a historical point in my time that I'm a mother of twins and one is here and one is not. It leaves an imprint. But it's still interesting, because that illusion of death happens to other people is not one that is in our nervous system as anchored as apparently it is in others. So I found that really interesting. Well,
what I love to do, and I do it sort of, I'm not a neuroscientist, and although, I have I have a pathological curiosity about the brain and the body, and it's ever changing. So anything that we were going to write or talk about today about the brain, we may know differently next Thursday. That, actually this part does this more. And I love that. I love that it's an evolving science. But what I generally talk about is like, your body and your brain is a freaking miracle. It is constantly working to protect you. So the idea that what you just said about the study in Israel, that like, essentially they just edited out those pictures, that the brain was able to be like, that's too threatening. We're just going to deny that exists.
Yeah.
That can have really terrible secondary problems. You forgot to call somebody back at work because it was uncomfortable, or it made you feel very afraid, or it made you, but it is what has helped us to survive. And so when people are coming into my office, which rarely happens anymore, but when they are, and they're coming in to tell me, Meghan, I feel crazy. I'm doing these things. I can't remember this stuff. Why would I behave this way? I love to be like, oh, well, let me show you what part of your brain is controlling what part of the rest of your body, and where the sent messages, it's like the mail went to your neighbor instead of where it normally goes to send the message for you to behave and do. And, even the fact that I wasn't sleeping, there's a part of your brain, your hypothalamus, that regulates like your body temperature. And yeah, it gets messed up in menopause like it is, but it also because the parts of your brain that are reactive, the limbic system, is way back by your neck. It's it's like those doors slam and the energy can't get to the rest of the brain. So when people say to me, I'm doing these things, I don't know why. Sometimes I don't know the immediate answer, but I'm like, somebody's going to know this answer. Some scientist out there is going to be able to say to us, why is this happening? And the person that I'm working with, it's not going to be the first time that, anything like this has ever happened. So one of the symptoms that people talk to me about, which they don't have much discomfort, they just report is like, I have no interest in sex at all. I feel like I'm never going to want to have sex again. But you know what? I talk to as many people who are like, all I want to do is have sex. That's all. I feel like I'm 14 years old. It's on my brain. I'm crazed. My body is really responsive to touch. And it is so comforting. And that feels awful to them, particularly if they lost a spouse and it's so comforting to be able to say, okay, look, there's this belief actually that bodies are meant for procreation. Someone really important to you just died. This probably is biologically an instinctual response. And the messages that normally go to the part of your brain that sends the signals about sexual desire and sexuality in general, they're getting mixed up messages right now. And so it's like that button is getting pushed in a different way. That kind of education, which is not complicated. I don't use I don't say hippocampus and hypothalamus and all that because I don't need to. That part of being able to say, we actually know this, there's no reason why you couldn't know it, is so comforting and so normalizing for people. And once they know it, it becomes this where they say to other people, oh my God, my grief therapist told me this thing. You'll never believe it. It's totally normal. The number of people who are devastated by brain fog, the most normal response, because your body is trying not to code every single memory of this horrifying experience that you're going through.
And I think it's the thing about the normalizing that you're speaking about, which, assuming that people who are experiencing first time significant loss or trauma are coming into a situation where they're more or less unprepared to deal with what's going on, with the intensity of emotions, with the somatic reactions, the mental reactions, all of that. And they're like, oh my God, I feel like I'm going crazy. And then when someone like you and I tell them, well, given the circumstances, this is actually pretty normal, the nervous system starts to relax. But it's like this education that is still lacking. Meghan, this conversation is far too interesting to end. So from all your experience that you so far already shared, the wide knowledge that you have both personally and professionally, what would you want other grievers and healers and traumatized people to know?
I think the most important thing for someone that is in deep feelings that feel deeply overwhelming is to feel some hope that this is a natural developmental process that everybody goes through. And, you're no better or worse than anybody else. So if you need help, if you have the thought in your head, I wonder if someone could help me with this, go seek help. That's enough. You don't need to suffer more to prove that you deserve to get some help. And that help doesn't have to be a therapist. If you fall into the categories of the trauma, if my story is very relatable to you, you had symptoms that were increasing for a really long time, seek a trauma therapist. But there are all kinds of other folks who are out there who are trained in grief and loss, coaches and chaplains and rabbis, and, that would be able to hold space so that you can get the resources that you need, which for many people is just validation that this is a normal experience and space and time to go to be in their feelings. The thing that I say the most is, grieving is a practice. It is something that we do. It's a verb. So when I'm coaching people, that is what I'm saying, is that even if you can just invite, 2 or 3% into your daily life that includes 2 or 3% of grief, you are doing the hopeful thing, which is telling yourself you're going to move through it, telling yourself you believe it's possible, telling yourself that this is survivable. And, it doesn't feel that way in the beginning, but we have statistics and most people do survive, even the most untenable loss.
That's beautiful the way you put it, and I recall just one other guest that says it's the differentiation between is it bearable or uncomfortable? And if it's unbearable, seek help. If it's uncomfortable, you might still want to have someone holding your hand through it. But as you said, why deny yourself the help?
My friend Laura Perry, who's a beautiful writer, says, is it hard for you or is it bad for you? And I just love that distinction because I can really tell the difference between those things. That at some point, hard becomes not good for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's finish this segment with the rapid fire questions, just a sentence starter for you to enlighten us. So first one, grieving and trauma means?
Intimacy with yourself. You're going to come to know yourself very differently and deeply.
That's a beautiful way to end this. I've never heard it in this way. And healing means?
Hope, transformation, change, forward movement.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
This question, what I have learned about myself is that I need other people, that I need to be witnessed, that I identify as a helper, but helpers need to be helped.
Just like dentists need dentists.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I think number 4, we've already spoken about is, so one thing, or maybe you just say one thing you wish people knew about loss and trauma.
Survivable.
One thing that has changed for you since your, the traumatic loss that you experienced in relation to your mother that you wouldn't want to miss, what would that be?
There is so much goodness that has come out of loss. If I really had to cull one, I am much more introverted than I understood myself to be.
Interesting.
That my extrovertedness and my helping has always come from a codependent kind of part of me, and that I actually require my own attention. It was grief would have been unsurvivable for me if I didn't direct my attention on myself, on my system and my own body. And when I came out of the very heavy, dark clouds of grief, I felt very greedy for my own attention. And I continue to be surprised by how much outside of my house and my life is a no, compared to when I just would say, why not? I can do that. That would make someone else happy. It's not going to cost me anything. It does actually. It costs me my own attention.
And I think especially us as helpers, natural helpers, it's good to realize that this is normal too.
That's right. That's right. I just didn't know it before.
Well, thank you so much. It's been, I'm looking forward to the second installment because we're speaking so much of the same language, and I hope we're not leaving the listeners behind with the language that we're using. But if it is, leave us a comment, and we'd love to come back and make it even more accessible to anyone listening to this. Well, thank you so much for your time, Meghan.
Thank you, Natalie. This was a delight.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.